Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Data and Dyslexia, Constructing Result-Driven Literacy Systems. My name is Lauren Brenner, and I'm on the marketing team here at Amplify. And in honor of Dyslexia Awareness Month, we encourage you to download your Dyslexia Support Power Pack to get all the answers you need about dyslexia. This Power Pack is brand new, and includes our Dyslexia Fact versus Fiction ebook, Dyslexia Toolkit, and our new Dyslexia infographic. I will drop that link in the chat momentarily as well. And by clicking that, you'll be able to access all three resources. And now I'm thrilled to introduce to you our special guest speaker with us today. Dr. Molly Ness is the Vice President of Literacy at Amplify. She is a former classroom teacher, reading researcher, and teacher educator. She earned her doctorate in reading education and spent 16 years as an associate professor at Fordham University. She has extensive experience in reading clinics, consulting with school districts, leading professional development, and advising school systems on research-based reading instruction. In 2024, she was invited to serve on the New York State Dyslexia Task Force. We are so lucky to have the chance to hear from Dr. Ness today. Welcome, Molly.
Thank you, and I'm so grateful to be here, and I'm so grateful that you have chosen to continue your learning and spend some time with us today. Most importantly, I am so grateful for the work that you are doing in schools and communities all over the world. It is always a challenging but rewarding job to be somebody who is in charge of education for children. So please know that your hard work does not go ignored by us at Amplify and by myself, who is also the parent of a school-age child. So we are speaking at the end of October, which is Dyslexia Awareness Month. We usually start out the month strong with lots of events. So I'm thrilled that we are wrapping up the month of October with an event around dyslexia. And let's start with where we will go today. Well, I'm going to sort of overview a bit about dyslexia, not just the myths and misconceptions. I'll encourage you to look at the resources in the Power Pack that are the Dyslexia Fact versus Fiction, but we're really going to try to examine some of the commonalities and discrepancies in the conversations about dyslexia before we dig into how to use data to identify students at risk, and then how that data can then springboard our instruction and intervention. And my hope is that you will leave understanding the importance of screenings in students' native languages. You'll see some pretty compelling results, which we will get to later in our session today. So let's first start with really being clear what we mean by dyslexia. There continue to be myths and misconceptions about what dyslexia is and is not. Just the other day, a friend reached out to me. Her daughter's kindergarten teacher had noted that the kindergartner was demonstrating some letter reversals and suggested that the child get screened for dyslexia or go see an educational specialist for dyslexia. And she reached out to me, and I had to say, dyslexia is not letter reversals, word inversions. That is one of the pervasive myths and misconceptions about dyslexia. We know that it's not linked to to intelligence. We know that it is also not a visual challenge. It has nothing to do with vision impairment. But what we do know about dyslexia is it is a deficit in students' phonological understanding. It's a deficit in their ability to understand the sound structure of language. And for the last 20 years, we've relied on a commonly accepted definition from dyslexia from the International Dyslexia Association, which highlights the phonological components of dyslexia. And we're at an exciting time in the literacy landscape where people are saying, do we need to revisit that definition of dyslexia? It's been the one that we've relied upon for about 20 years. Do we need to revisit it? And there has been an uptick in articles and writing about that. I will encourage you, if you are somebody who likes to get into the weeds of reading research, please reach out to me. I'm happy to share any of these articles for your ongoing reading and learning. And what we really need to understand is that there are so many definitions out there, but they all come together across some commonalities. So I'm pulling from a 2020 article which looked at the 5 most commonly recognized definitions of dyslexia from these different organizations, from the International Dyslexia Association, from the British one, the Rose Report, etc. And it looked at how all of these definitions, what they have in common, rather than the discrepancies. And so let's examine some of those commonalities as we really clarify what we mean about dyslexia. Well, the biggest commonality is that dyslexia is a deficit in the phonological components. It is a student's weakness or struggle to break language into the sound components. Students with dyslexia have a hard time linking letter sounds and letter names, so their decoding abilities are impaired. And then that decoding struggle becomes sort of a domino effect, a negative cascade of effects that influence all of the literacy outputs that that child then puts forth in terms of their fluency. If your phonological awareness is weak, it is more laborious and more difficult for you to lift words off the page, which therefore impedes your fluency. If you are exerting so much cognitive energy on lifting words off the page, when your fluency dives, so does your comprehension. So many times we see some of the later ends of reading struggles manifest as struggles to understand or make meaning of text. And we have to really understand what are the foundational reasons behind those struggles. We know that dyslexia is neurobiological, meaning it is based or rooted in the brain. It is, as I will show you with some brain scans in a minute, a particular underactivation of the part of the brain that is really primarily responsible for linking sounds and letters together. And when you link those letters and sounds together to become a reader, you push those individual sounds, those phonemes together to decode unfamiliar words. And our students with dyslexia, that is the big breakdown in their literacy development, that those components are so challenging for them. Dyslexia, of course, exists on a continuum. So you can be mildly dyslexic all the way to profoundly dyslexic. But we again know that neurobiological root. I'm pulling now from a 2024 article by Marianne Wolf and colleagues who explain the neurobiological components of dyslexia, that it's a unique organization of the brain. As we'll see in a moment, students with dyslexia underactivate parts of the brain that are really the parts that we activate for reading, and they compensate by activating other parts of the brain which are not the efficient neural pathways that develop for the reading brain. And because of that organization, where the part of the brain with phonological processing at its core is weaker, we see these difficulties in fluency and spelling and comprehension. One of the most common misconceptions is that dyslexia is linked to intelligence, and we of course know that it is not. And we also know that dyslexia is not, it is something that evolves and can change over time, and we'll see some of those preventative factors towards the end. I'm pulling now from an article by Devin Kearns, which really explores the neurobiology of dyslexia. It is an incredibly readable article, and it's open access, meaning if you Google the neurobiology of dyslexia, Kearns, you will be able to access this on your own. It's not behind a paywall. So this is the first reading that I would encourage anybody to explore on your own or your school system to do a study around. But what this article does, in addition to helping us really understand the neurobiological components of dyslexia, is really sort of break down some of the complications with identifying students with dyslexia. And here is one of the challenges, that when there are all these different definitions of dyslexia, yes, they have commonalities. Yes, they all point to this struggle with phonological processing. But when there is not one commonly accepted definition, that makes it more difficult for us to identify students with dyslexia and, of course, then intervene with students with dyslexia. So you can start to see how some of the challenges in the wording of these different definitions can have implications at the school level, at the policy level, etc. But we do know that dyslexia is fairly common. I often hear the report that 1 in 5 students, or up to 20% of our population, is dyslexic. That tends to be a statistic given forth by education advocacy groups who it may be on the higher side. When you look really at the research, you see a pretty big range from 3% to 17%. And of course, when you look at this, that's a big range from 3% to 17%. Why is there that variation? Well, some of the variation is because there is not one typically common, one definition that is just the gold standard for defining dyslexia, and also because there isn't a single test or single way to identify students with dyslexia. Instead, as we'll see later, to really identify students with dyslexia, we need to look at lots of different components of literacy and understand how those things come together to give a profile of a student who may be struggling. So another thing that we need to be mindful of is, as I'm saying, dyslexia has this neurobiological component, meaning it is rooted in the brain. But yet we are not at a place where we use neuroimaging in schools and reading clinics and other places where students are diagnosed with learning difficulties. So what we're really measuring is we're measuring an output of a child's understanding of literacy, but we're not necessarily looking at brain scans themselves to really understand that neuroimaging. And that's why some of those learning difficulties have been difficult to define. And also, our identification criteria have changed over the years. If you've been in the classroom or education system for quite some time, you may be familiar with the discrepancy model, in which we looked at the difference between a child's IQ and their literacy achievement as a way of identifying students. We are now using other criteria, and so those things have changed over time, which often can contribute to some of the confusion. And even different organizations, professional organizations, use different terminology. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, used by psychologists and mental health professionals, uses specific learning disorder, whereas our federal legislation uses specific learning disability. So we start to see some of the differences between the complications of these differences as well. But again, we do know these neurobiological components. So I want to just walk quickly through what you're seeing here as an image of the brain. And the camera lens, imagine that the camera is coming to you from the left side. So what you see is that dark gray circle. That would be sort of like right behind almost my left earlobe. So what we know about dyslexia is students with dyslexia show less activation in the part of the brain that is sort of in between the midline of my brain and my right ear, the temporal parietal region, which is the part that is associated with sound, symbol correspondence. So if you're not super familiar with how the brain develops in terms of the literacy pathways, I'll give a quick overview. That the big idea is that reading is a skill that involves integration of different parts of the brain. Through explicit instruction, we take regions of the brain that are not immediately next to each other, and we activate them through neural pathways that have to be formed by explicit instruction. First, what happens is an area of the brain sort of right above our brainstem in the nape of our neck, it's called the letterbox, is responsible for helping us identify the visual representation of letters. So it literally helps us understand the shape of letters, that this is a letter versus a number, this is a letter versus a random squiggle. So it helps us instantly recognize letters, and that's the letter box. Well, next in brain development, we activate a part of the brain called that temporal parietal area. And this part of the brain is responsible for the sound that is affiliated with that letter. So before this, all we're seeing is a random squiggle on the page that's meaningless. Well, we have to give meaning to that squiggle, and that squiggle is activated with its sound in the parietal temporal area. And this part is where students with dyslexia underactivate the parts of the brain to do that work and have struggles. Well, then what happens is we have to take that temporal parietal area and really use it to push individual sounds together to decode or lift words off the page. And then we activate an area of the brain sort of right before the frontal lobe. You might see it as the IFG. This is the area of the brain that helps us link meaning to the word that we've just decoded. So what happens again is if we see the word bat, our our letterbox recognizes the individual letters. Our parietal temporal area links the letters to the sounds and then pushes the individual phonemes into the word itself. And then we activate the area towards the frontal lobe, which gives that word meaning. So is it a Halloween bat or is it a baseball bat? And what I've walked through in this really sort of step-by-step process is, for most proficient readers, instantaneous. It takes about 250 milliseconds. And what you might see on this screen is a red pathway. The red pathway we often call the dorsal route. This is the part that, this is the pathway by which beginning readers and readers who are in early reading development, who are still learning their letter sound recognition, this is the route that they use. Proficient readers and readers who are more mature and more advanced, they use another more efficient network, and that's what you see in the green area. And that we call the ventral pathway, and that's more efficient, more effective because it's bypassing the need to decode words and link the letters and the sounds. So again, what we know about our students with dyslexia is that activation in the temporal parietal area doesn't look like the activation of a normally developing reader. So what we start to see is differences in brain activation. And what happens is it's not just it's not less interaction, it's just a different pattern of interaction. Their brains are not working more slowly, they are working differently. Now, the good news is because of the neuroplasticity of our brains, meaning our brains are changeable, shapeable, malleable, we can help students with making their brain activation look more like that of a normally developing reader. I'm showing you that there are multiple levels of dyslexia. There is a biological level of dyslexia. And by what I mean by that is we've discussed that it is neurobiological, it's rooted in the brain, but there is also a genetic component. Dyslexia is strongly heritable. If you are a child of parents or with dyslexia, you have a 50% chance of being dyslexic yourself. That's getting at the biological level. What we often see then is the phonological processing deficits, your struggles with language. And then what we start to see in our classrooms and schools is that if you struggle with the sound symbol correspondence and the understanding of our sound structure, it again causes that negative cascade of behaviors in your literacy development. We see it in our classrooms as weak spelling, as decoding that is not fluent or instantaneous, as sometimes slower processing speeds, like in things with rapid automatized naming. And I'm showing you, just as I spoke, The brain on the my left side, is the three areas that are typically come together to form those neural pathways that are the development of the reading brain, versus the brain on the right, which represents the brain of a dyslexic reader. And you can see again, they're underactivating the portions of the brain, the parietal temporal area, which is again responsible for the sound structure of language, and they're overactivating different parts of the brain. So again, it's not that they're using less of the brain, it's that they are using an activation pattern that is different than those of normally developing readers. We also know that dyslexia has a whole sea of sort of characteristics and traits that we often see together in terms of students. We see that can be challenges with memory. One of the things that we do for students with dyslexia is we test their phonological memory, meaning their ability to take sound structure and units of sound and store them and retrieve them instantly. We might see disorganization. We might see processing slower, meaning they have a harder time getting their thoughts out, or they struggle to locate a word that they're trying to come up with. So they talk around a word, or they often use more abstract language. So they might use thing and stuff rather than a specific noun that they are trying to locate. And there's been a lot of conversation about this notion of the gift of dyslexia. In fact, even on social media, there has been a movement that if you are dyslexic yourself, you can mark your profile, hashtag gift of dyslexia. And I would very much encourage us to be mindful of this idea that, is dyslexia a gift? And are there challenges when we represent dyslexia as a gift? And I would encourage you to listen to the Science of Reading podcast, episode 7 from season 7, by one of the most nationally recognized experts in dyslexia, Tim Odegaard, who is dyslexic himself. And he talks about the so-called gift of dyslexia. And you may have heard some of these notions that people with dyslexia are artistic or creative or innovative, or they have more emotional intelligence or entrepreneurial mindsets. And we've often seen profiles of highly successful dyslexics. And Dr. Odegaard cautions us by saying, there's some challenges with that. He writes that it's a well-intentioned idea that dyslexia is a gift, because of course we are moving away from the deficit lens and looking at a different lens. But that notion of a gift may inadvertently contribute to positive stereotypes, and then actually do disservice to students by helping them, giving them imposter syndrome, or having them feel more pressure, what have you. And Dr. Odegaard also goes into the science. Is there real data showing that dyslexia is a gift? And Dr. Odegaard really concludes that as of yet, there is not any science affirming some of these traits, which we often think about as positive attributes of dyslexia. So I encourage you to read more about that and to think through, is this belief actually causing more harm? Because as literacy expert Steve Dykstra reminds us, that regardless of where you are with your identification of dyslexia, that too often our students with dyslexia undergo trauma. And when we look at the percentage of students with dyslexia, we often see a very high correspondence with regard to mental health struggles, with things like depression and anxiety. So often kids come to school eager to learn how to read. When they are dyslexic, they struggle and then internalize feelings of failure. And that can often lead them towards a negative cycle of trauma and self-doubt. And so we want to be mindful of the importance of early identification and really clearly communicating what dyslexia is and isn't. And a vital part of that is really using the best possible data to identify students for dyslexia. So let's talk first about screeners versus identification of students with dyslexia. I think of a screener as the exact same process that we all go through anytime we want to travel by air. Every single person has to go through TSA screening. And you take off your shoes and you put your bag on the conveyor belt, you walk through the metal detector to identify, are you at risk for potentially having something that is harmful to the airplane or to your fellow passengers? Now, that's the first level of screening. Everybody goes through that. Now, if you were to set the alarm off, you would be pulled aside. Or maybe you've had the experience where they take your bag and they ask you to search it. That's the next level of screening. So we can think of that airport screening as that universal screening. And then with that same analogy, when we pull people aside and get a little bit more information, maybe TSA does a quick pat down, maybe they go through your suitcase. Those are the more diagnostic, probing, really getting more data after that initial screening. So the purpose of a screener is to identify who is at risk for the behavior, and the behavior that we're talking about here clearly is dyslexia. And it then lets us really identify who potentially is going to need that intervention and who is not. So screening, again, is for risk, whereas diagnosis is really understanding the profile of that student. Now, our screenings are universal because they are brief. They don't take a lot of class time. They are low cost. Because they are relatively easy to administer, they can be done multiple times a year. And they are measures that are valid and reliable. So they have gone through the statistical screening to make sure that the comparison norms are there, that you can use with different populations of students, versus a diagnosis. And that diagnosis is something that you have to have a certain level of credentialing. You have to have studied psychometric testing, or you have to go to the school psychologist because of how time intensive they are. And because they are time intensive and can only be done by a certain population of people, they also have a cost affiliated with them. So we want to be mindful that whatever screener we are using, that screener is universal and it is early. Screeners really should be happening as kids are coming in, for some of them, their first ever school experience, which is kindergarten. Now, what do screeners need to include? Well, for early literacy, our screeners are really probing at children's foundational understanding of the language structure of language. So these are the tasks that are rhyme, identifying the ability to take words apart and put them back together, which is manipulation at the phonological level. We're also looking at students' ability and immediate ability to name letters and their letter sound correspondence. So we would give them a picture of the alphabet, the letters out of order, and ask them first to just name the letters as quickly as they can, again, out of order. And then at another level, to name the sound associated with that language. We also want to get their phonological memory with nonsense words, or sometimes we call them pseudo words. Now, what we're having kids here do is we'll tell them a made-up word like MIP, and they hear somebody say it, and then they say it back to that person. So what we're getting at is we're getting at their processing, their language processing of hearing linguistic units, storing them, and then retrieving them as quickly. We also look at phoneme segmentation, blending, and manipulation, particularly at the first grade level. How well students understand the individual sound structure of letters, the individual sound the letter is, and their ability to take a word and manipulate it. So say the word trip. Now say the word trip without the sound. Can they come up with tip? Because what we are doing here is we are taking words, playing with the sounds, removing one sound, pushing that new word back together, and all of this happens orally. By the middle of first grade, we start to get to more reading fluency. So we start to get to more of a student's ability to automatically lift words off the page. And we also start to add in some of that nonsense word fluency. We also want to make sure that those screeners don't just end at kindergarten and first grade, because we know that the vast majority of students actually are identified right around third grade. So the screening for second grade is a little bit more sophisticated. And for the kids who don't meet the benchmarks in the screeners, then we go back and maybe pull in some of the tasks that happen in the kindergarten and first grade level. So here kids are reading words in isolation. So they read a word list as quickly as they can. They are both real words, so they are using their automatic word recognition, as well as nonsense words. And why nonsense words? When you decode a nonsense word, a word that does not exist in our language, you have never seen it before because it is by very nature, a nonsense word, you are getting students' purest measure of their phonics knowledge, their ability to attack an unfamiliar word and lift it off the page. Now, there's been some confusion about nonsense words. Nonsense words are really there for assessing kids. We are not meant to be drilling kids or teaching nonsense words. Instead, they are a window into a student's phonics knowledge and not something that we would provide classroom instruction around. We also continue with reading fluency because at this point we should start to be seeing students move into more fluent reading so that they can get to comprehension. And then we also, of course, look for different components of language because we know so many of our students with dyslexia also struggle with language. There's a big overlap between our students who need interventions from a speech language pathologist and students who also have challenges with literacy. So what we look at is we look at the normal bell curve, and to really identify those kids who have been flagged for screeners and then have gone through more intensive levels of assessment, typically what we look at is kids who are about 1.5 to 2 standard deviations outside of the mean. Now, when you look at the bell curve, which is the sort of distribution of the normal of the population, you have to keep in mind how wide the area under the average curve is, because we're trying to get the kids at the outside of the normal range. So it is often sometimes when you work with parents and you'll say they're struggling, but their scores are not yet 1.5 to 2 standard deviations away, and that's really the trick with that level of identification. Now, we also need to be mindful that when we do these screeners also occur in students' native language or home language, particularly for our bilingual students. So I'm going to show you some data which shows how frequently our multilingual learners are misrepresented or misflagged when screeners only happen in English. So we know that when we only provide screeners in our students in English alone, that typically what happens is we're not capturing their knowledge and skills in their native language that then transfer to English. And we often over-identify students who actually are not dyslexic. And I'm showing you results from a 2019 study out of the University of Oregon. When pre-kindergartners were assessed in English, 63% of them were identified as needing levels tier 2 and tier 3 for pull-out small group intervention. But look at how much that narrows when we also assess that same population in their native language of Spanish. Now we're really able to figure out, is this a language issue or is this a literacy issue in terms of this? So we're really starting to understand the importance of how much those screeners should happen in students' languages to represent the richness of their language and to give them the ability to leverage what they know in their native language to English. So take a look at this as well. Similar data from that same 2019 study. Look at the big differences between the beginning of year data. 86% of kids, when they were assessed in English only, were identified as reading and needing a reading intervention. And then look at how much it dropped when we also included a Spanish assessment, and you can see that that happens not just at the kindergarten level, but throughout all of these different grade levels, because we have to be mindful that students' native languages is a huge benefit to their literacy development in English. And so being really careful to make sure that our screeners are available in more than one language, because when we provide those dual language screenings, we reduce the population who is identified as struggling readers. So we are being more mindful to divert resources to those that are really in need of them. We are saving time, we are saving money, and we are then able to really focus on the students that are at risk for later literacy struggles, not just representing students that the issue is actually another language. So how do we choose those literacy assessments that are both that are dual language? Well, we have to make sure that we're considering all of those components, those foundational literacy skills, that we are getting measures of letter sound awareness, of word identification, of spelling, that we can make sure that they are specifically mindful of linguistic features in both English and Spanish, and that those data then are the springboard into actual instruction. Our data are only as useful as the instruction that we provide based off of that data. So we want our screeners to be easy and efficient, and then most importantly, really link to instruction. So what does that instruction then look like? Well, I'm going to show some research from Hugh Katz, who is at the Florida Center for Reading Research, who reminds us that an ounce of prevention is better than a pound of diagnosis and treatment. And so as the United States, I know we're a global audience now, but as the United States has adopted so many different state legislative levels around early screeners, why are we being so mindful of early screeners? Because, as Hugh Katz reminds us, an ounce of prevention is so essential. So let's take a look at the windows of opportunity. So when we're looking at our pre-K to first grade classrooms, as we do those universal screeners, as we figure out who is at risk, we are, first of all, being more cost effective and preventing later reading failure, but we're also being mindful to capture students at the window of instructional opportunity, meaning the time that their brains are most plastic, most shapeable, most changeable, and our instruction is really going to make the difference that it needs to. as well as avoiding the cascade of negative effects in terms of the student's socio-emotional development and feeling about themselves as readers. So we want to avoid those negative consequences and capture that when our instruction is intensive, it is early, it is more effective. And so we often call this sort of the window, we often call this the dyslexia paradox, that most students are identified with dyslexia at about grade 3. But the early warning signs have been there since pre-K and kindergarten. And so what has happened between kindergarten and 3rd grade? Well, students are lagging further and further behind as their peers read more, get more access to vocabulary, have better sense of reading and better identities of themselves as a risk. And so this gap between when students are typically identified and when students really are most responsive to instruction is typically referred to as the dyslexia paradox. And Hugh Katz and Yakov Petcher, his colleague also at Florida Center for Reading Research, also remind us that there are both resilience factors and risk factors. So we talked about phonological awareness and phonological deficits as one of those big risks, but we also know that students with language delays or language impairments are also certainly at risk for dyslexia, knowing that oral language is, of course, the foundation for literacy. Attentional deficits, there is a high correspondence between students who are dyslexic and students who have ADD or ADHD. I want to be very clear that when we talk about visual problems, I don't want at all to send the message that dyslexia is caused by visual problems. We know that is one of the most common misconceptions, but instead it is a risk factor. But there are also resilience factors, structured literacy approaches that are targeted, that are provided early, that are explicit, concrete, multisensory, all of those things is a huge factor that leads to students being able to make leaps and bounds with regard to literacy progress, as well as support from their family, support from their school system, and then their mental approach, their mental resiliency, their growth mindset. All of those are resilience factors. So we so often focus on the risk, but there's also some good news in terms of what can help set a student who initially may be struggling on a path towards progress. I want to point out, I'm going to actually fast forward through this one because the print is so small, but I want to encourage you to take a look at the International Dyslexia Association, who just released an updated wheel or updated image on what we mean by structured literacy. And structured literacy is both the what and the how of effective literacy instruction. In the inside part, the purple circle, you see what should instruction consist of? Well, it should consist of all of these components. It should consist of instruction provided at the sentence and the sentence structure and grammar level, what we think of as syntax. It should entail instruction on vocabulary and background knowledge and how essential they are to vocabulary. It should, to comprehension, it should consist of explicit instruction in the phoneme-grapheme correspondence, the overlap or the correspondence between letter sounds and letter names. It should also look at the morpheme level, which are units of meaning, and how when we add morphemes, we are changing the meaning of a word in addition to the structure of the word, as well as syllables and orthography, what we often talk about with regard to spelling. So the purple is the what. What are we going to focus on? And then the outside wheel is the how. How are we going to provide this instruction? Well, we're going to do it in a way that is highly explicit. It leaves nothing up to chance. There's no student discovery sort of left up to on their own. It is sequential. It is based on data, just like the data that we've talked about earlier. It is targeted and scaffolded and interactive. We know that learning is not a spectator sport, that it entails kids doing some of the heavy lifting themselves, so that we can start to bring all of these components together to do the what and the how of effective literacy instruction that we know to be the structured literacy approach. So I also want to encourage you to visit the Evidence Advocacy Center, which makes up this really lovely diagram that helps remind us that the screener that we see on the far left-hand side is something that is going to take the temperature on all of our kids. It's going to identify who is at risk and who is not. Then we're going to provide them that core instruction, that general classroom instruction, that is high quality instructional materials, that classroom instruction, that core instruction that is structured literacy. So it's the what and the how, and that also students may need some of that intervention, and that intervention has to be closely connected to our core instruction. So we have to be mindful that kids who are getting our tiers 2 and 3, they're not getting something entirely different or detached from what they're getting in their core instruction. Instead, they're getting more intensity, more exposure, more explicitness at the intervention level, and that same cycle of diagnosis and progress monitoring and explicit instruction is happening at the intervention level. And again, there's that give and take between the core instruction and the intervention level. So I believe I'm going to turn the floor to Lauren for, it looks like we may have a couple minutes for questions. So Lauren, I would love for you to pull some questions from the audience.
Yes, thank you so much, Molly. That was such a great presentation. And thank you to all of our attendees for joining us live today. Your discussion of comparing universal screening to TSA or general screening at the airport was so spot on, such a great comparison to use. So thank you again for sharing all this wonderful insight and such great positive feedback throughout the presentation in the chat. And yes, we have some time for questions. Let's dive in. We got a question from Susie. Ohio has us assess kindergartners for possibly having dyslexic issues. How do we help and direct parents who need a more definitive answer?
How do we direct and help parents with a more definitive answer? Well, fortunately, we are at a time where there are so many amazing resources for parents. If you go to the International Dyslexia Association, there is an entire library of resources for parents. I think that one is a great first place to direct students to direct parents to. Because we have to, you're right, when parents have a lot of questions, and many parents have some of these myths and misconceptions of what dyslexia is. So I would not be surprised if you have to do some parent education on what dyslexia is. So take advantage of the resources that are out there from places like International Dyslexia Center, Yale Center for Dyslexia, UCSF, University of California at San Francisco also has some great resources. And then that Devin Kearns article that I shared earlier, that is open resource, also has a list of resources to direct parents and caregivers to.
Awesome. And I shared that link to that resource as well in the chat. I was able to Google it while you were speaking and share that PDF. We received a question from Megan. Do you have guidance or resources for how to support dyslexic language learners or newcomers?
So what we know, I would love to say that there was something different for our students who are struggling readers and language is also, they're developing English. There's nothing different. There's just more intensity, more explicitness, more levels of intervention. So students there are probably going to need more targeted instruction, more explicit, some of the level 2 and tier 3 levels, but structured literacy is still the same approach. It's just going to be a different amount of dosage, a different amount of explicitness, probably more repetition as well to make the neural pathways really concrete and clear. But wouldn't it be great if there was like a sort of magic recipe for a specific subpopulation? But we know, again, it's really just structured literacy. We also have to be mindful of our students with dyslexia are so often struggling in the foundational skills, the word identification, lifting words off the page. But our students with dyslexia who are multilingual learners also are going to need more instruction in language comprehension. They're going to need sort of that top part of Scarborough's rope as they develop their English proficiency.
And thinking about that those multilingual group of individuals, are there any screeners that you would recommend or that come to mind that are in other languages beyond just English and Spanish? I know Amplify M-Class Dibble's 8th edition. We have in M-Class Lecturo, this is our Spanish version. Anything beyond English and Spanish that you would recommend?
The one that I know the best and really advocate for the most is M-Class, because as we choose our screeners, we want to make sure they're reliable, they're valid, and they link to instruction, because we know teachers are busy and we don't want to put more work on their plate of, here's your data, now you have to figure out what to do with it. So we want to make sure that we're selecting screeners that really closely link to instruction. And those dual language screeners, there are few and far between that have all of those sort of check components on my checklist. So M-Class is probably the most reliable, best one.
Validity, reliability, and of course, easy to use, and those reports that are easy right in front of you, definitely key, especially when time is of the essence. And we know teachers don't have a lot of time on their plate. I think we have time for one more question. How do you use the phonological manipulation with adults, and is it appropriate?
So phonological manipulation, let me make sure everybody understands what it is. So phonological awareness is our understanding of sound structure, and it is everything that we can do orally. So it is the name game, Molly, Molly, Bobali, Banana, Fana, Fafali. To do that, I have to take sounds apart, push new parts together to come up with that. And in terms of phonological manipulation, adults still need it, but I would not hold adult learners back if some of those skills were not in place. For example, if I had an adult who was struggling with rhyme, I can still move on to letter sound correspondence. I wouldn't hold them back till some of those underlying phonological components are in place before we get to the most advanced level of phonological awareness, which is phonemic awareness, and that's the letter sound correspondence matching up.
Great. And actually, I think we have a little bit more time, and a few other questions did just pop in, so let's take a look at them. How do you recommend starting to work with a student who shows dyslexic tendencies, B, D, P, Q confusion, but struggles to identify their right from left?
But struggles to. So the B, D, P, and Q, those are the ones that kids most typically struggle with for a couple of reasons. First of all, they look like all of the letters look similar. They're all the same basic shape of a circle and a stick, and they are challenging kids' understanding that, like if I kick over a chair and I see that chair on the floor, that chair is still a chair. But with a letter, if I change the shape of a letter, it changes the entire letter itself. So that's a foreign concept to kids. The other challenge with the B, D, P, and Q is they also are made in the mouth at very similar places. So when you make the B sound and the P sound, your lips and your mouth basically do the same thing. So it's very easy for kids to confuse. So typical for developing readers, but I would continue to give those levels of multisensory explicit instruction with lots and lots of repetition. So we would need to connect the sound to the letter and then connect that also to meaning. So we would want to make sure that we're giving those, if they're practicing the B versus the D, that they're connecting it to decodable text, and that they're also getting to multiple levels, the sound, the structure, the appearance, all those levels.
Great. And I know we talked about, you gave examples of screening for K to 1 and 2 to 3. A question came in, would screening change for an older student, 5th to 6th grade? And if so, how so?
So typically what our screeners do is they start at a level and then you would move down in terms of, they would start at a level where a fifth or sixth grader would read text. We would look at their fluency, we would look at their spelling, and if their fluency isn't making the benchmark, then we move down to probe for the underlying reasons why their fluency might not be where it should be. Because once we've identified, hey, they're not making the benchmark, we have to figure out, well, what is causing that? I always make the comparison when I go get my eyes examined. It's not useful if the doctor says you need glasses, you need to know what your prescription is. So we have to then go back and do those different levels where what phonetic features, what linguistic features has the student not yet mastered, so that I can target those, provide explicit instruction in those, so that we can close that gap between where they are and where they should be.
Thank you so much, Molly. That was such a great presentation, and what a great wrap of questions that we had, and appreciate you taking the time to answer each of them. So before we hop off, just a last minute, I have a few more housekeeping items. We encourage you to subscribe to Amplify's podcast, Science of Reading the Podcast, which we were just informed today was a 2024 Signal Award winner. So exciting things. And we linked in the chat Tim Odegaard's podcast episode, and Dr. Molly Ness herself is actually also on a podcast episode. We encourage you to listen to that one as well. And our newest podcast, Beyond My Years, where our host Ana Torres seeks out educational insights from seasoned educators. So subscribe now to both of these podcasts to be sure that you don't miss an episode. And we just want to say thank you again for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your day. And thank you again, Dr. Ness.
Thank you.